The land had always been there, patient and cruel, waiting for some lonely soul to make the mistake of calling it home. It stretched wide beneath a merciless sun, baked into cracked layers of red earth and sagebrush, a place where even the wind seemed too tired to sing. Men rode past it for years, shaking their heads at the sight of its broken fences, its leaning corral, and the skeletal frame of a ranch house that seemed more like a grave marker than a dwelling. No one wanted it. No one believed it could yield anything but sorrow. But then came the cowboy. He wasn't remarkable to anyone who saw him passing through towns, just another drifter with dust in his hair, lines carved deep into his face, and the look of a man who had long forgotten what it meant to be part of anything. His horse was gaunt, his boots chewed by miles of rock and grit, and his eyes carried that familiar hunger. The hunger for a place where silence wasn't a curse but a comfort. When he heard by chance that the old McGraw ranch could be had for $50, he almost laughed. $50, a month's wages for a drover. The cost of a single hand of cards lost to bad luck, and yet with that small sum, a man could buy an entire stretch of land. Land that bore his name, that waited only for him. He paid without asking questions. The man who sold it to him at the back of a saloon seemed eager to let it go, pushing the paper across the table as though it burned to the touch. The cowboy tucked it into his vest and rode out the next morning, a roll of tobacco between his teeth, whispering to himself that perhaps fate had finally grown tired of mocking him. Perhaps for once the road had led him somewhere other than deeper into ruin. When he arrived, the sun was beginning its slow fall, painting the horizon in red fire. The ranch revealed itself in fragments. First, the line of a weather-beaten fence half swallowed by the earth, then the crumbling posts that once held a gate, and finally the house itself. A husk, its roof sagged like an old man's shoulders, its windows dark, its door hanging open in a crooked welcome. He reined in his horse, staring at it for a long time, listening. No birds, no voices. Only the rasp of wind moving through tall grass, and the groan of wood settling against time. It should have felt empty. It should have felt his, but it didn't. The cowboy dismounted, boots crunching against the brittle soil, and walked slowly to the porch. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if he had intruded on a silence that belonged to someone else. He touched the doorframe. The wood was warm, pulsing faintly under his palm as though it held onto the memory of many hands before his. He stepped inside. The air was stale but not dead. There was the faint smell of smoke, recent, as though a fire had burned within the hearth not long ago. He frowned, running his hand along the table in the corner. No dust, no cobwebs hanging thick in the rafters. Someone had been here, not weeks ago. Days, perhaps hours. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Words were useless out here. Instead, he moved carefully, exploring the small rooms. A bed frame without mattress. A trunk left half open with nothing inside but an old strip of cloth, a broken mirror leaning against the wall. He felt it in his bones. This ranch wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. He unpacked his saddle, set his few belongings near the door, and lit a small fire to chase away the growing dark. Flames licked against the stone chimney, their light stretching shadows across the room. He sat down heavily, rolling another smoke, listening again to that silence. It pressed close around him, heavy, aware, and then, faintly, he heard it. A whisper of movement outside. Not the wind, not the creak of wood, something slower, deliberate. He rose, hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver, and stepped to the doorway. The night had swallowed the land in shades of indigo and silver, the moon just a pale coin behind drifting clouds. He scanned the fence line, the corral, the distant rise of land beyond the well. Nothing, only grass bending, only the sound of his own breath. But the feeling remained, eyes on him, unseen, unblinking. The cowboy stood there for a long time, until the fire inside the house began to gutter and fade. Finally, he returned to the chair, revolver laid across his lap, sleep fighting to claim him. His last thought before the dark took him was that the land he had bought for $50 was not empty at all. It was full of silence, full of waiting, full of something that had been here long before him and would remain long after. When dawn came, the cowboy woke stiff and cold. He stepped outside, stretching, the light burning gold across the open plain. And that was when he saw them. 3 figures standing by the corral, motionless, watching. They were women. Apache, their hair long, their faces carved with the same endurance as the earth itself. Their eyes did not waver. They stood not as strangers trespassing, but as those who had always belonged. They did not move toward him, nor did they retreat. They simply watched. 3 shadows rooted in silence, 3 pieces of a story he had not asked to inherit. The cowboy froze, breath caught in his chest. His hand twitched toward his gun, then stilled. There was no threat in their stillness, no weapon raised, only an ancient presence, heavy and undeniable. His mouth was dry. Words rose and died in his throat. He had come here believing the land was his, believing the $50 had bought him peace. But the truth stood before him now. The land was theirs. It had always been theirs. And as the sun climbed higher, burning away the night, the cowboy understood that what he had purchased was not freedom, nor solitude, nor the promise of a home. What he had bought was a secret. What he had bought was a reckoning. The silence deepened. The 3 women did not move. And the cowboy, for the first time in his long, wandering life, felt the weight of belonging not to a place, but to its ghosts. The cowboy had spent most of his life alone, yet he had never known silence like this. Silence on the trail was one thing, the whisper of wind through canyon stone, the distant call of a coyote, the steady creak of saddle leather beneath a burning sun. That silence was familiar, honest, but the silence of the 3 women who stood before him now was something altogether different. It was not absence. It was weight, a silence that pressed down, filling the air between them like smoke that would not clear. They stood near the corral, their dark hair stirred by the faintest breeze, their eyes never leaving him. They were not children, nor were they old. Their faces bore the unsoftened marks of a people who had lived close to the earth, close to loss, close to battles that most white men only knew from whispered stories. They did not flinch, they did not move. They simply existed, rooted in the soil as though the land itself had called them forth. The cowboy's first instinct had been to reach for his revolver. But even now, as his hand brushed the grip, something in their gaze stilled him. They were unarmed, at least in the way he understood weapons. No rifles, no bows. Yet there was power in their stillness, a warning in the simple fact of their presence. He lowered his hand, though his chest felt tight, as if the very air resisted his breathing. He wanted to speak, to ask what business they had on the ranch he had paid for, the ranch that was his by deed and by right, but the words stuck like thorns in his throat. He realized suddenly that he had no right at all. Not here, not before them. $50 and a piece of paper meant nothing against the centuries that pressed into their faces. So he said nothing, and neither did they. The standoff stretched through the morning. The sun climbed higher, washing the land in merciless light, and still they stood. The cowboy busied himself with his horse, pretending calm, checking the animal's hooves, adjusting the worn saddle leather. But his eyes kept flicking back, each time finding theirs, unbroken, unblinking. It was as though they were waiting, not for him to move, not for him to speak, but for him to understand. By noon, sweat ran down his back, though the air was cool in the shadow of the porch. He finally carried a bucket to the well, drawing water that smelled of iron and stone, and offered it to the horse. When he turned back, the women were gone. Not walked away, not retreated, simply gone as if the land had swallowed them. He froze, bucket in hand, staring at the empty corral. His pulse hammered against his ribs. That night, the ranch felt tighter. He lit a fire again, though this time it brought little comfort. Every creak of the timbers seemed louder, every gust of wind through the cracks colder. He told himself he had imagined them, that 3 Apache women could not have simply been waiting here for him. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, their silence, and it burned into him like a brand. He dreamed. In the dream, he walked across the land, though it was not his land. The earth beneath his boots was slick with blood, and the air carried the sour stench of smoke. He saw soldiers, faces twisted with hate, rifles flashing in the sun. He saw women and children running, falling, screaming. He saw flames devour a house that looked far too much like the one he had just bought. And in the dream, at the edge of it all, stood the three women, watching unflinching.
Their eyes upon him as though he too had taken part in the slaughter. He woke with a shout.
Sweat chilling his skin, his hand clutching the revolver that lay across his lap. The fire had burned down to coals, casting the room in a red glow that looked too much like the embers of his dream. He rose and stumbled outside, needing air, and there they were, again. This time they stood at the edge of the well, three dark figures against the pale wash of moonlight. They were closer now, close enough that he could see the lines of paint across their cheeks, faint but deliberate. Symbols, marks of mourning or of war, he could not know. He froze, heart pounding, unable to speak. They said nothing. One lifted her hand slowly and touched the well's stones as if claiming it. The cowboy realized then that this place was not merely land. It was ground hallowed by something older than him, older than his country, older than the promise of $50. They turned and walked away into the darkness, vanishing once more into the endless night. The cowboy sank against the porch post, trembling. He did not know whether to saddle his horse and flee, or to stay and face whatever truth the land was hiding. But deep in his gut he knew there was no leaving. He had bought this place, not with money, but with his very soul, and the three women were the keepers of that bargain. When the dawn came again, he found something new. At the threshold of the house, pressed into the dirt, lay 3 stones arranged carefully in a line. He bent to pick one up and found it warm, though the air was cool. He dropped it quickly, his hand shaking. It was a sign, a message, a claim. The cowboy knew then that this ranch was not his. It had never been his. It belonged to the silence, to the blood, to the women who waited in shadows. And he, whether he willed it or not, was caught inside their story. The morning came pale and trembling, the sun creeping over the distant ridges like an anxious witness to a land that had seen too much. The cowboy stirred on the porch, the weight of the previous night pressing into his shoulders. Sleep had not brought relief, only visions that clung to his mind with the sticky persistence of cobwebs. He remembered the 3 women, their silence, their unyielding gaze, and something inside him clenched like a fist. This land was alive in ways he could not yet name. He moved cautiously across the yard, every step measured, every creak of wood beneath his boots, a reminder that the house was older than he had imagined. It had been built on soil that whispered, not with wind, not with leaves, but with memory. Each footfall seemed to awaken the echoes of what had happened here. He stopped at the corral, staring at the dry earth, at the footprints he did not recognize. There were impressions of moccasins, shallow but deliberate, and he felt a shiver trace the line of his spine. The ranch was speaking to him. He entered the house and noticed a small pile of charred wood in the corner, ashes that were not his own fire. Something had been burned here recently, a ritual perhaps, or a remembrance. His gaze drifted across the walls, catching on scratches, deep and purposeful. Symbols, lines and curves etched into wood and plaster. He recognized some from the stories he had heard in towns, legends passed around in whispers by men too polite to speak the truth. But these marks were alive. They seemed to move in the flicker of sunlight that streamed through the broken windows, as if the house itself was breathing, alive with memory and warning. The cowboy's heart thumped hard in his chest, a drumbeat to accompany the land story. The ranch had a history he could not yet see in full, but fragments pressed against him, urgent and insistent. And the 3 women, they were its guardians, the living thread tying him to this past. As he explored further, he found more, remnants of old fire pits, stone markers half buried in the soil, and the distant scent of charred flesh lingering faintly in the breeze. Each discovery pulled him deeper into the story, a narrative of blood and fire and survival that no paper deed could ever cover. The ground beneath him was soaked with histories of pain, massacres carried out by men who thought the land theirs by right, by law, by greed. Men who had left their mark in more than footprints, in bones, in ashes, in the silent screams that still seemed to echo across the plains. That night, Sleep offered him no sanctuary. Dreams returned with a vengeance. He walked again through the past, seeing it unfold as if the land itself conspired to show him everything he had bought. A ranch house burned, children and elders fleeing in terror, the sky raining smoke and sorrow. And there, in every vision, the three women appeared, not as ghosts, but as anchors, their presence steady against the chaos, watching, waiting, judging. They were witnesses and protectors, and somehow he understood they had always belonged here. When he awoke, his hands were stained with dirt, his body aching from the weight of what he had seen in dreams. The morning sun had climbed higher, harsh and revealing. The women were there again, at the edge of the corral, faces inscrutable, eyes steady. He felt their gaze pierce him, a silent demand he could not ignore. And then, as he approached cautiously, he noticed something he had missed before. Small, subtle signs around the property. Stones arranged in lines, etched symbols in trees, hidden markers that spoke of warning, of protection, of ownership beyond any paper. It was then he realized the land was not empty. It had never been empty. Every tree, every stone, every hollowed place in the soil held the memory of what had happened here. He was not the first intruder, nor the last. He had purchased only the surface, the visible, but the land itself claimed its own history. And the three women were its keepers. Days passed in a rhythm that felt unnatural. The cowboy worked the land, attempting to cultivate it, to bring some measure of peace to the soil, but it resisted him. Tools would break inexplicably. Water from the well tasted strange, carrying a faint metallic tang. The horses skittish, shadows seemed to shift where none should be. And always the women watched. From the ridge, from the corral, from places he could not see but felt their presence. He began to speak to them, softly, muttering apologies for being here, for not understanding. They did not answer. They only watched. And slowly, in their silence, he began to learn. The land was sacred, haunted not by spirits alone, but by history itself. The blood of the innocent and the guilty had soaked into the soil, and the echoes of what had been done could not be erased. He was part of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, casting the land in a deep, bruised purple, he found another sign. Near the old barn, hidden under a pile of broken timber, lay a small bundle of leather and bone. Careful, he opened it to discover carved tokens, feathers, and strips of cloth. Remnants of lives that had been here before him, lives that had been lost to fire, to greed, to war. He understood then that the three women were not just waiting. They were protecting, guarding the memory, the justice, the vengeance of the land itself. The cowboy fell to his knees, suddenly small, insignificant, and painfully aware of the price of ownership. $50 had bought him nothing but entry. Ownership required more than money. It demanded recognition, humility, and a willingness to carry the weight of the past. And he, for all his years wandering, had nothing to offer but ignorance. As the night fell and the wind whispered through the grass, he felt a presence closer than ever before. One of the women stood at the edge of the firelight, face half hidden, watching him. He wanted to speak, to ask her questions, but he knew better. The land, the women, the history, all of it demanded patience. He was to learn by watching, by listening, by enduring. The ranch was no longer simply a place of shelter. It was a crucible, and the cowboy, who had wandered so long seeking freedom, realized that freedom here would come only at the cost of understanding. Only by acknowledging the whispers of the land, the weight of history, and the silent watch of the women could he hope to survive, and perhaps in time belong. The sun rose like a blazing witness, painting the plains in cruel gold that revealed every scar of the land. The cowboy worked quietly, attempting to tame the wild earth, raking dust, repairing fences that groaned under decades of neglect. Yet, the land offered no peace, only the echo of lives that had been stolen long before he arrived. Every step he took seemed watched, every motion measured by eyes he could not see, until finally they appeared again. 3 dark figures at the edge of the corral, watching him, silent and unyielding, as though measuring his understanding, his worth, his very soul. But this morning brought more than the women. From the horizon came the distant rumble of hooves, a rhythm too heavy and too deliberate to be the wind. The cowboy squinted, heart tightening. A group of men rode toward the ranch, leather dusting their boots, rifles glinting in the unforgiving sun. Their faces were set with greed and the kind of arrogance that comes from believing the land belongs to those who seize it by force. He stepped forward, raising a hand in cautious greeting, though he knew the gesture meant nothing. They circled, the property like predators, eyes sharp, hands hovering over triggers, mouths muttering about land, gold, and claims that had been buried too long to matter. The cowboy realized with a growing horror that $50 had bought him nothing of consequence. The paper deed in his vest was meaningless against men who understood only power. And worse, the women, the three shadows he had glimpsed, silent and unblinking, were here as well, not as companions, not as guests, but as guardians, their presence an unspoken threat, a warning that the land remembered, and vengeance waited patient as stone. He moved closer to the nearest woman, hand brushing against the revolver at his hip. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. He could see the faint scars along her forearms, the way her body had learned endurance, had learned war. And he knew, then, with a sinking certainty, that the quiet he had relied on, the silence he had assumed was empty, was nothing but the calm before a storm older than he could comprehend. The men approached, shouting now, their voices cutting through the tense air. They demanded the land, laughing at the notion of deeds and dollars, claiming ownership by law and threat. The cowboy tried to reason, tried to explain that he had purchased it, that the women were... He hesitated, realizing no words could convey the truth. They did not understand, could not understand the weight of history pressing through the soil, the spirits that lingered in the wind, the living guardians who waited for him to comprehend before striking, and strike they would. The first man raised his rifle, cocking it with careless arrogance. A breeze shifted, carrying with it a faint whisper, a warning carried through years of blood and memory. In a single, fluid motion, one of the women stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not scream. She moved like the wind itself, swift and precise. Her hand was a blur, a weapon unseen, a force that knocked the rifle from the man's grip and sent him sprawling into the dirt. The others hesitated, confusion cracking their confidence. The second woman emerged from the shadows, her eyes cold, her stance unyielding. She circled the intruders, and with a silent command, the air seemed to tighten around them, fear blooming like fire in their veins. The third remained near the corral, patient, assessing, ensuring the cowboy understood what it meant to survive here, to respect what had always been sacred. Chaos erupted. The men, realizing brute force would not suffice, drew pistols, shouting threats, stepping into a land that had already chosen its defenders. But the women were not merely fighters. They were spirits of memory, embodiments of justice long delayed. Each move was deliberate, each strike precise, and the cowboy, once alone and bewildered, now stood at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. Gunfire cracked, dust rose, and the land itself seemed to recoil, echoing with screams that were not entirely human, blending with the past, with the shadows of those who had fallen here decades before. The cowboy ducked behind the porch, heart hammering, revolver trembling in his hands. He saw the three women moving as one, a silent triad of fury and survival, and something inside him broke. The illusion of ownership, the arrogance of solitude. He realized fully now that he had bought nothing of the land, that the $50 had been a threshold, a test, an invitation into a story older and darker than he had ever imagined. By sunset, the men lay broken, fleeing, cursing the land and its defenders. The cowboy emerged, shaken, breath ragged, eyes meeting those of the three women. They said nothing. They never spoke, yet he understood completely. This place was theirs, and only with their consent could he remain. Night fell, The ranch, scarred by gunfire and struggle, was silent once more. The cowboy sat alone by the dying fire, contemplating the cost of his decision, the price of intrusion. $50 had bought him entry, but survival demanded far more: respect, humility, and a willingness to bear witness to the past. He had come seeking solitude, a home, perhaps a claim to the world. Instead, he had found responsibility, history, and the cold weight of justice carried in the eyes of 3 Apache women, and in that silence, he knew the land had spoken. He had listened. The night settled over the ranch like a velvet shroud, heavy and unyielding. The stars hung cold and distant, indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath them. The cowboy sat by the dying embers of the fire, hands clasped over his knees, the weight of all he had witnessed pressing into his bones. The land, once a blank canvas of opportunity in his mind, had revealed its true face, a land that remembered, that bore scars deeper than the eye could see, a land whose memory demanded reckoning. The 3 women moved silently through the shadows, guardians of that memory, embodiments of the history that had soaked into the soil. They carried no malice, no cruelty, only the certainty of their place, and the certainty that anyone who entered without respect would bear witness to what the land demanded. Their presence was both comfort and warning, a paradox the cowboy struggled to understand. In the days that followed, he worked the ranch not to claim it, but to honor it. He tended to the fields, repaired the fences, and cleaned the remnants of violence left by those who had challenged the land's authority. Yet, every task was a lesson, every moment a reminder that his ownership was borrowed, fragile, contingent upon his ability to see beyond himself. He was learning to listen, truly listen, to the whispers of earth and wind, to the silent language of the women, to the echoes of lives long past. One morning, as the sun broke over the hills in a fiery burst of red, the cowboy approached the women. He did not speak. Words felt small, inadequate. Instead, he offered the land itself, the water, the soil, the fire-heated stones, as a gesture of respect. The women regarded him, expressionless yet attentive, and in their stillness, he felt a measure of acceptance. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. The first step toward belonging. The days bled into weeks. The land no longer seemed hostile, but it remained unyielding. He learned to read the subtle cues, the direction of the wind, the movement of the shadows, the faint markings in the dirt that indicated unseen passages, hidden routes, and ancient graves. And always the women watched, teaching without teaching, guiding without guiding. They did not allow him to forget, and he did not wish to. Each day was a reminder that freedom here was earned, not bought. Yet peace was never absolute. At times the night brought dreams of fire and blood, the screams of those who had died on this ground. He would wake, sweat-soaked and trembling, and find the women standing just beyond the firelight, silhouettes against the darkness, eyes steady and unwavering. And each time he understood more clearly. He had entered a covenant with the land, a pact unspoken, yet binding. He had paid $50 for a deed, but the true cost was far higher. It was the price of respect, of vigilance, of memory carried forward with humility. One evening, as a storm rolled over the plains, lightning revealing the skeletal frame of the ranch in stark flashes, he felt it fully. He belonged. Not in the sense he had imagined when he first rode in, alone and hopeful, but as part of a story older than himself, a story written in blood, endurance, and silence. He had survived, but only because he had learned to listen, to yield, to witness. And perhaps in time he would understand the depths of belonging that the land demanded. The women did not speak, did not offer guidance in words. They simply existed, their presence a constant, a reminder that some histories cannot be erased, some debts cannot be ignored. And the cowboy, who had wandered the world seeking a place to rest, realized at last the truth of the land he had bought, that to truly own it, he must carry its memory, honor its pain, and live within its reckoning. When the storm passed, leaving the plains washed clean and glimmering beneath a pale sun, the ranch stood as it always had, a place of beauty and terror, of life and death interwoven in a tapestry that no man could unravel. The cowboy walked among the fields, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, hearing the silent voices that had guided him, protected him, and tested him. He understood now that home was not a purchase, nor a possession, nor a solitary claim. It was an acceptance of responsibility, a submission to the land's own narrative, and the courage to endure its weight. And so the ranch endured, as it always had, guarded by the women who had waited, patient and unyielding, and a cowboy who had learned the hard truth, that in the wild, untamed West, nothing comes cheap and everything exacts a price. He had paid $50 to own land, but he would spend a lifetime paying to belong.